Okay, let's dive in. So, the 19th century in Europe, it's a time of just massive change, isn't it? Big ideas swirling around.
Absolutely. You've got these powerful forces reshaping everything. Old empires, old ways of ruling, they're starting to crumble.
And right at the heart of it is this really powerful idea, nationalism,
Yeah.
this concept of the nation.
It's transformative.
Mm.
It fundamentally changes how people see themselves, who they owe loyalty to. It's not just about the king or the dynasty anymore.
It's about belonging to a nation. And that's what we're exploring today using these fantastic sources you brought together, really digging into how this idea of the nation state took hold and pushed aside those older ways of ruling.
Yeah, and what forces were really driving it, because it wasn't just one thing. We could start with Frederick Sorry's print from 1848. It's quite something.
It really is. This vision he had, a sort of utopian dream, right? A world of democratic and social republics.
Exactly. And you see all these different peoples marching together towards liberty. They've got their flags, their unique costumes. It's visually striking.
And he includes groups like the Germans with their flag, even though Germany wasn't actually a unified country in 1848, so it's aspirational.
Very much so. It's a vision of unity based on shared identity, not forced rule. And look down at the bottom. You see the shattered symbols of the old absolutist regimes.
Right, those monarchies with sort of unchecked power. Centralized, militarized, often pretty repressive. He shows them breaking.
And that highlights a key distinction we need to grasp. The difference between just a modern state with a ruler and a nation state.
Okay, what's the core difference there?
Well, a nation state isn't just about territory and power. It requires this shared sense of identity, a common history, a bond among the citizens themselves. And crucially, our sources stress this commonness often had to be made, forged. It wasn't always just there naturally from ancient times.
That idea of forging identity is fascinating. Ernst Renan really picks up on this, doesn't he?
He does. He argues very strongly that a nation isn't about objective things like sharing a language or race or even territory.
So what is it about for Renan?
It's more spiritual, you could say, a large-scale solidarity. It comes from a shared past, shared sacrifices, shared efforts, devotion, and it needs a common will right now, in the present, a desire to continue that shared life.
He calls it a daily plebiscite, like a vote you take every day just by choosing to belong.
Exactly. It's a constant, active commitment. And he believed this was essential for liberty. Nations, for Renan, were a safeguard against the kind of universal empires that could stifle freedom.
Okay, so if this national identity has to be forged, where does that process really ignite? Where's the spark?
Our sources consistently point to the French Revolution, 1789.
The first clear expression of nationalism, as one source puts it.
Yes, because it fundamentally shifted the source of power. Sovereignty didn't reside with the monarch anymore. It transferred to the French citizens. The people became the nation.
And they seemed to understand immediately that they needed to make this real for people, didn't they? Through actions and symbols.
Absolutely. They introduced concepts like la patrie, the fatherland, and the citoyen, the citizen. Powerful ideas to foster belonging.
And the tricolor flag, electing a national assembly, writing new hymns, taking oaths, remembering martyrs. It's all about building that collective story.
And practical things, too. Central administration, uniform laws for everyone, getting rid of internal customs duties, standard weights and measures.
Even trying to promote a standard French language over regional dialects. It's quite deliberate nation building.
It really is. These weren't just administrative tweaks. They were aimed at creating a single, unified people.
And they didn't want to keep it to themselves, apparently. The sources say they declared a mission to help other European peoples become nations, too.
Yeah, to liberate them from despotism. And this message definitely got out. News spread, inspiring people elsewhere.
You see Jacobin clubs popping up in other cities, like the one shown in that German almanac cover from 1798.
That's right. Students, the educated middle classes. They were receptive. These clubs kind of paved the way for the French armies, which then carried these ideas of nationalism across Europe, sometimes literally.
Which leads us neatly on to Napoleon. His armies march across Europe, spreading some of these revolutionary ideas. But it wasn't quite straightforward, was it? More of a mixed bag.
Definitely a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
He did bring major administrative reforms to the territories he conquered, places like the Dutch Republic, Switzerland, Italy, parts of Germany.
The Napoleonic Code, 1804, that was huge, right?
Groundbreaking. He got rid of privileges based on birth, established equality before the law, secured property rights. Really modern ideas.
And simplifying administration, ending feudalism, getting rid of guild restrictions, improving transport. You can see why some people might welcome that, especially, say, businessmen.
Oh, absolutely. Uniform laws, standard weights and measures,
Hmm.
a common currency in some areas that massively simplified trade and commerce. So initially, in many places, the French were seen as harbingers of liberty.
Ah,
But that initial welcome often turned sour. The administrative benefits started to be outweighed by the negatives.
like higher taxes,
Yeah.
censorship.
Exactly. And forced conscription into Napoleon's armies. People were being forced to fight his wars. The enthusiasm faded fast.
That print showing the Tree of Liberty being planted in Germany really captures that shift, doesn't it? The French soldiers look more like occupiers than liberators.
Yeah, harassing people, taking supplies, and the inscription someone added is just dripping with sarcasm. Freedom and equality for us, the model of humanity. It shows the resentment building up.
And eventually that overreach led to his downfall, like in the caricature of him losing territory after the Battle of Leipzig.
The tide turned against him.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. Before the revolution, before Napoleon, what did Europe actually look like politically? Who did people identify with?
Well, the sources are clear. Nation states as we think of them today just weren't really on the map in, say, the mid-18th century.
So what was there instead?
You had highly fragmented regions. Think of Germany, Italy, Switzerland. They were patchworks of kingdoms, duchies, cantons, all sorts of small territories.
And then the big empires, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe.
Right, autocratic empires ruled by dynasties. The Habsburg Empire is the classic example.
And that was incredibly diverse, wasn't it?
Hugely diverse. Inside the Habsburg lands, you had German-speaking elites in Bohemia, Italian speakers down in Lombardy and Venetia, Magyar speakers in Hungary, alongside people speaking various Slavic dialects, Poles in Galicia, plus all sorts of different peasant groups, Bohemians, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croats, Rumans, different languages, different ethnicities.
So what held it all together?
Really, just one thing. Loyalty to the emperor. There wasn't a shared Habsburg identity or culture binding everyone together horizontally. Allegiance was vertical to the ruler.
And socially, who held the power in this pre-nationalist world?
Overwhelmingly, the landed aristocracy. They were a small group numerically, but they dominated society and politics.
And they had a shared lifestyle, even across borders.
Yeah, a common culture in many ways. Owning large estates, townhouses, often speaking French as the language of diplomacy and high society, connected through marriage networks. They were a transnational class in a way.
And below them.
The vast majority were peasants. In Eastern and Central Europe, many were serfs, tied to the land and obligated to their lords. That was the basic social structure.
So if the aristocrats weren't pushing for nations, and the peasants weren't, where did this drive for national unity come from?
It emerges strongly with new social groups. Industrialization starts, first in England, then spreading to parts of the continent like France and the German states. This leads to the growth of towns and, crucially, the rise of commercial classes.
So new groups like factory workers, but also business owners, professionals.
Exactly. Working class emerges, but also these middle classes, industrialists, businessmen, lawyers, doctors, professors.
And they are the ones who really latch on to these ideas of national unity.
Yes, particularly the educated, liberal middle classes. As the old privileges of the aristocracy started to be challenged or dismantled, these groups saw national unity and a more modern state structure as being in their interest.
Which connects directly to this idea of liberal nationalism. Let's unpack that. What did liberalism mean to these middle classes?
Well, the root is liber, meaning free. So fundamentally, it meant freedom for the individual and equality for everyone before the law.
Politically, what did that translate into?
They wanted government by consent, not by divine right of kings, an end to autocracy and the special privileges of the clergy. They push for constitutions, representative government through parliaments, and importantly, the protection of private property.
But equality before the law, did that mean everyone got to vote?
That's a crucial caveat. Generally, no. Early liberalism often restricted suffrage. In revolutionary France, for example, only men with property could vote initially. The Napoleonic Code actually rolled back some rights, particularly for women.
So it was a limited form of equality. Women, the non-propertied, they had to keep fighting for their rights separately.
That's right. It was an ongoing struggle within and alongside the broader liberal movement.
And economically, what was the liberal nationalist agenda?
Freedom of markets. They wanted to abolish state restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. They saw these as barriers to economic growth.
The situation in the German states before 1834 is a perfect illustration, isn't it?
A textbook case. You had those 39 states left over from Napoleon's reconfiguration, each with its own currency, its own weights and measures. Imagine being a merchant.
Trying to move goods from Hamburg to Nuremberg, facing 11 customs posts, paying duty each time.
Exactly. And even a basic measure like the L for cloth varied in length from city to city. It was incredibly inefficient, a real drag on economic activity.
A major obstacle to economic exchange, as the sources say.
Definitely. So the commercial classes were desperate for a unified economic zone. This pressure leads directly to the Zollverein.
The customs union, started by Prussia in 1834.
Yes. It abolished most of those internal tariffs and drastically reduced the number of currencies from over 30 down to just 2. It also spurred things like railway development, creating better connections.
So it wasn't just about making trade easier, was it? It had a bigger goal.
Precisely. It was about harnessing economic interests for the cause of national unification. Friedrich List, the economist, put it perfectly. The Zollverein aimed to bind the Germans economically into a nation, strengthening it and awakening national feeling through shared prosperity. Economic nationalism fueling political unity.
Okay, so we have these liberal and nationalist ideas bubbling up, but then Napoleon is defeated in 1815. What happens next? Does the old order just snap back?
The major powers tried to restore the old order. They embraced conservatism. Their focus was on preserving traditional institutions, the monarchy, the church, existing social hierarchies, property rights, the family unit.
But did they want to go back exactly to how things were before the French Revolution?
Not entirely, and this is important. Most conservatives had learned something from Napoleon. They saw that some aspects of modernization, like an efficient bureaucracy, a modern army, maybe even a more dynamic economy, sometimes even abolishing feudalism, could actually strengthen their own autocratic rule, make it more effective.
And this new conservative order was largely designed at the Congress of Vienna in 1815.
Yes, hosted by the Austrian Chancellor Metternich. The main goal was to undo Napoleon's territorial changes and, crucially, restore the monarchies he'd overthrown.
So the Bourbons back in France, creating buffer states around France, redrawing boundaries?
Right. Prussia got territory in the west, Austria gained control of northern Italy, Russia got parts of Poland. The German Confederation of 39 states was basically left untouched, still fragmented. The overall aim was to restore a balance of power dominated by conservative monarchies.
And these restored regimes, they weren't exactly fans of dissent or criticism.
Not at all. They were autocratic. They clamped down hard. Censorship was widespread, controlling newspapers, books, plays, songs. Anything that smacked of the liberty and freedom associated with the French Revolution was suppressed.
Like in that caricature, The Club of Thinkers, where intellectuals literally have muzzles on.
Perfect visual of the climate of repression. They feared the power of ideas.
But ideas are hard to kill. The memory of the revolution lingered, didn't it? And liberals kept pushing back.
Absolutely. And one of their key demands became freedom of the press. It was a direct challenge to the conservative censorship.
With open political activity suppressed, where did these liberal nationalists go?
Underground. This period, after 1815, sees the rise of secret societies all across Europe.
What was their purpose?
To train revolutionaries and spread their ideas covertly. Being a revolutionary at this time meant opposing the monarchies established at Vienna and fighting for liberty and freedom. And they increasingly saw creating nation-states as essential for that fight.
And Giuseppe Mazzini is probably the most famous figure associated with these societies.
A key figure, an Italian revolutionary, involved with the Carbonari early on. He was exiled in 1831 after a failed uprising.
But exile didn't stop him. He founded Young Italy and Young Europe.
Yes, from Marseille and Bern. He brought together like-minded young people from various parts of Europe, Poland, France, Italy, the German states. He was a networker.
And what was his core belief?
He believed nations were natural, God-given units of mankind. Italy, fragmented as it was, had to be unified into a single republic. He saw unification not just as a political goal, but as the essential basis for Italian liberty.
And his ideas were influential beyond Italy.
Definitely. His model inspired similar secret societies elsewhere. He genuinely frightened the conservative powers. Metternich famously called him the most dangerous enemy of our social order. You can see why.
So you have this tense situation, conservatives trying to hold the line, revolutionaries working in secret. It feels like something has to give.
And it does. This leads into the period known as the Age of Revolutions, roughly 1830 to 1848. Liberalism and nationalism become strongly linked with outright revolution in many places.
Often led by those educated middle classes we talked about.
Yes, professors, teachers, clerks, businessmen, they were often at the forefront, especially in places like the Italian and German states or parts of the Ottoman Empire, Ireland, Poland.
It kicks off again in France, July 1830.
France sneezes again.
Ugh.
The Bourbon monarchy, restored after Napoleon is overthrown, replaced by constitutional monarchy under Louis Philippe.
And that sends ripples outwards.
Just as Metternich predicted. The July Revolution sparks an uprising in Brussels, which leads to Belgium breaking away from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands.
And another really significant event in this period is the Greek War of Independence.
Yes, starting back in 1821, the Greeks fighting for independence from the Ottoman Empire. This became a huge cause célèbre across Europe.
Why did it capture the imagination so much?
Partly due to sympathy for Greeks living under Ottoman rule, but also because Western Europeans had this deep admiration for ancient Greek culture, seen as the cradle of European civilization.
So poets and artists got involved, like Lord Byron.
Exactly. Byron actually went to fight and died there. Artists like Delacroix painted dramatic scenes like the massacre at Chios, works designed to stir sympathy and support for the Greek cause against the Muslim Empire. Culture mobilizing political support.
And Greece did eventually win independence.
Yes. Recognized by the Treaty of Constantinople in 1832. A major victory for nationalism.
You mentioned culture, Delacroix, Byron. It wasn't just about politics and wars, was it? Culture played a huge part in building this national feeling.
A vital role. We see this especially with the Romantic movement. Romantics often criticize the Enlightenment's focus on pure reason and science.
What did they focus on instead?
Emotions, intuition, mystical feelings. They wanted to create a sense of a shared collective heritage, a common cultural past, as the true basis for a nation.
Like Johann Gottfried Herder's idea of the Volksgeist, the spirit of the people.
Exactly. Herder argued that true German culture wasn't in the elites, but in the common people, das Volk. It was expressed in their folk songs, folk poetry, folk dances.
So collecting folklore became a nationalist project?
Very much so. It was about discovering, or sometimes constructing, the authentic soul of the nation. Think of the Grimm brothers.
Famous for fairy tales, but they were doing more than that.
They were lawyers and linguists. They collected these folk tales, seeing them as pure expressions of the German spirit, especially important when Germany was fragmented and partly under French influence. They also worked on a massive German dictionary, another nation-building project, through language.
And focusing on vernacular language and folklore.
Yeah.
That was also a way to reach ordinary people, right? Many of whom couldn't read.
Precisely. It helped spread the nationalist message beyond the educated circles. This was crucial in places like Poland.
Poland, which had been partitioned and didn't exist as a state.
Right, but national feelings were kept alive through culture. Composers like Karol Krupinski used opera and music, turning traditional dances like the Polonaise and mazurka into nationalist symbols.
And language itself became a battleground there.
Yes, after a failed Polish uprising in 1831, the Russians tried to impose the Russian language. The Polish clergy resisted, using Polish in church services and religious teaching. Many were punished for it. Polish became a powerful symbol of defiance against Russian rule.
So you've got liberal ideas, revolutionary actions, cultural movements, but underlying all this, especially leading up to 1848, there was also real economic hardship, wasn't there?
Immense hardship. The 1830s were tough across Europe. Population was growing rapidly, meaning more job seekers than jobs. People were migrating from the countryside into overcrowded city slums.
And competition from industrialized England was hitting hard.
Yes, particularly for small-scale producers like weavers working at home or in small workshops. They couldn't compete with cheaper, machine-made imports.
Plus, in many areas, peasants were still burdened by old feudal dues owed to landowners.
Add to that rising food prices, bad harvests. By the mid-1840s, you had widespread poverty and real desperation in many parts of Europe.
And this explodes in 1848.
It does. Food shortages, unemployment, it boils over. In Paris, people put up barricades, King Louis Philippe flees, a republic is declared.
And they introduce universal male suffrage, promise a right to work, set up national workshops, trying to address the economic issues too.
And this popular unrest wasn't just in Paris. Remember the Silesian Weavers' Revolt back in 1845? It wasn't directly nationalist, but it showed the depth of the misery.
The weavers protesting against contractors cutting their pay.
Yes. Wilhelm Wolff's account is harrowing. They were desperate. They marched, demanded higher wages, property was damaged, the army was called, 11 weavers were shot. It's a stark picture of the economic tensions of the time.
So these popular revolts driven by hardship happened alongside, and perhaps fueled, what the sources call the Revolution of the Liberals in 1848.
Exactly. The educated middle classes saw this moment of widespread unrest as their chance. In places that weren't yet unified nations, Germany, Italy, Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire liberals tried to harness this energy.
Combining their demands for constitutions and freedoms with the goal of national unification.
Yes, they wanted nation-states based on parliamentary principles, constitution, free press, freedom of association.
And the Frankfurt Parliament is the big symbol of this effort in the German lands.
It is. Middle-class groups organized elections across the German regions for an all-German National Assembly. 831 representatives met in St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt.
And they drafted a constitution for a unified Germany, a constitutional monarchy.
That was the plan. A German nation headed by a monarch, but one responsible to a parliament.
But it didn't work out.
No. The King of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, refused the crown on those terms. He wouldn't accept authority from an elected assembly. He, along with other monarchs and the aristocracy and military, opposed it.
And the parliament lost popular support, too.
Its social base narrowed. Dominated by the middle classes, it tended to resist the demands of workers and artisans who had also been part of the uprising. So it lost that broader backing. Eventually troops were called in, and the assembly was forced to disband. A failure for the liberal nationalists.
And within this liberal movement itself, there was controversy over women's rights.
The really significant point. Women had been incredibly active, forming political associations, publishing newspapers, participating in meetings and demonstrations, yet
they were denied voting rights. Like in the Frankfurt Parliament, where they could only watch from the gallery.
Exactly. Source C shows the debate. You have Karl Welker arguing women belong in the home, that equality would upset things. But then you have Louise Otto Peters passionately arguing that liberty must be for everyone, not just half of humanity. And an anonymous reader pointing out the absurdity of denying rights to educated women while uneducated men could vote. It shows the limits of liberalism at the time.
So 1848 ends with the suppression of these liberal revolutions, but it wasn't a complete return to the old ways.
No, the conservatives had been rattled. They realized they couldn't just ignore these forces forever. They started making concessions.
Like abolishing serfdom in the Habsburg lands in Russia, giving Hungarians more autonomy.
Yes, the monarchs learned they had to adapt, grant some reforms to head off future explosions. The old order couldn't be fully restored.
And the dream of national unification didn't die with the failure of the liberal approach in 48. It just shifted gears.
Completely. After 1848, nationalism changes character in many ways. It becomes less tied to liberal democracy and revolution, and more often harnessed by existing states, by conservative forces, to build state power and achieve political dominance.
Germany and Italy being the prime examples. Let's take Germany first. The liberals failed in 48, so who takes charge?
Prussia, under its chief minister, Otto von Bismarck, a master of realpolitik.
Not a liberal idealist, then.
Far from it. His approach was unification through the strength of the Prussian army and bureaucracy, his policy of blood and iron, not speeches and votes.
And he achieved it through war.
3 wars in 7 years. Against Denmark, then Austria, then France. Prussia won all 3.
Culminating in that scene at Versailles in 1871.
January 1871. In the Hall of Mirrors, the Prussian King William I is proclaimed German Emperor. A unified Germany, forged by Prussian military might.
And the new German Empire reflected that Prussian dominance, modernizing currency, banking, law, but based on the Prussian model.
Very much so. It was unification from above, driven by the state. The caricature of Bismarck managing the parliament suggests where the real power lay.
Okay, what about Italy? Also fragmented for centuries. Mazzini's Republican efforts failed. Who picks up the pieces?
Again, it falls to the strongest Italian state, Sardinia-Piedmont, under its king, Victor Emmanuel II.
And like Bismarck, his chief minister, Cavour, wasn't exactly a revolutionary.
No, Cavour was a shrewd statesman, a diplomat. Spoke French better than Italian, apparently. He wasn't a Democrat, but he saw unification as a way to boost Sardinia-Piedmont's power and promote economic development.
How did he manage it?
Through clever diplomacy, first. He secured an alliance with France to help defeat the Austrians, who controlled northern Italy in 1859.
But there was a popular element, too, with Garibaldi.
Absolutely crucial. Giuseppe Garibaldi, a charismatic figure, a dedicated nationalist, maybe more of a romantic revolutionary than Cavour.
The leader of the Red Shirts.
That's him. In 1860, he leads his volunteer army, the Expedition of the Thousand, into southern Italy and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies.
And he gets support from local peasants.
Yes, they rally to him to help drive out the Spanish Bourbon rulers. Garibaldi's campaign was vital in bringing the South into the fold.
So Italy is proclaimed united in 1861 with Victor Emmanuel II as king.
Correct. Though the sources at funny telling detail many of the illiterate peasants supporting Garibaldi in the south had little idea about Italy as a nation. Some thought L'Italia was the king's wife.
It shows how unevenly these nationalist ideas spread, and Rome only joined later.
Yes, Rome remained under papal control, protected by French troops. Garibaldi tried to take it in 1867 but failed. Only in 1870, when France had to pull its troops out because of the war with Prussia, did Rome finally become part of United Italy. The caricature of Garibaldi helping the king pull on the Italy boot captures that collaboration.
So Germany and Italy unified largely through state power and war after the liberal dreams of 48 faded. Now, Britain is called a strange case in our sources. Why?
Because its path to becoming a nation-state was so different. Not a sudden revolution or unifying war, but a long, drawn-out process. And there wasn't really a British nation before the 18th century.
People thought of themselves as English, Welsh, Scot, Irish first, with their own culture.
Exactly. Primary identity was ethnic. But the English nation grew stronger, wealthier, more powerful. And the English Parliament, especially after it gained supremacy over the monarchy in 1688, became the key instrument.
The Act of Union with Scotland in 1707 is a major step.
It creates the United Kingdom of Great Britain, but the sources are clear. It was effectively England imposing its dominance. The new British Parliament was dominated by English members.
And Scottish culture was suppressed.
Systematically. Scotland's distinctive institutions suffered. Speaking Gaelic was discouraged, even banned in places. Wearing traditional Highland dress was forbidden for a time. Highlanders were often forcibly removed from their land. It wasn't a union of equals in practice.
And Ireland's situation was even more fraught.
Deep divisions there between the majority Catholic population and the Protestant minority, who were supported by the English. Catholic attempts at rebellion, like Wolfetones in 1798, were crushed.
And then Ireland was formally incorporated into the UK in 1801?
Forcibly incorporated. So this British nation was forged, but it involved propagating a dominant English culture. The Union Jack, God Save the King, the English language becoming paramount. The other nations survived, but as junior partners.
It really underscores that nation building can be about power and suppression, not just unity. Okay, so these nations are forming. How do people visualize them? How do you give a face to something abstract like France or Germany?
Artists turn to allegory, personifying the nation, usually as a female figure.
Like liberty or justice in the French Revolution.
Exactly the same principle. The figure isn't a real woman, but she gives the abstract idea of the nation a concrete form people can relate to.
So who are the allegories for France and Germany?
For France, it was Marianne, a common popular name emphasizing the idea of the people's nation. She wore symbols of liberty like the red cap, carried the tricolor. Her statues were put up in town squares, her image on coins and stamps, making the republic visible, tangible.
And Germany had Germania.
Yes, Germania, often shown wearing a crown of oak, leaves the German oak, symbolizing heroism. Other symbols seen with her, as Boxery explains, include broken chains for freedom, an eagle for strength, a sword for defense, sometimes an olive branch for peace, the black, red, gold flag of the 48 liberals, and rays of a rising sun for a new era.
These weren't just pretty pictures then. They carried specific political meanings.
Absolutely. Look at figure 17, Faith's Germania for the Frankfurt Parliament, hopeful, aspirational. Then figure 19, Cleison's Germania fiercely guarding the Rhine, more militant. And figure 18, Hübner's fallen Germania from 1850.
Painted right after the failure of the 1848 revolution, she looks defeated.
It's a powerful commentary on that failure. These images help shape how people understood and felt about their nation.
Okay, we've tracked nationalism from idealism to state building. But by the late 19th century, the sources suggest it takes another turn, a darker one, linking up with imperialism.
Yes, this is a crucial shift. By the last quarter of the century, nationalism often loses that early liberal democratic idealism.
Yeah.
It becomes, as one source puts it, a narrow creed with limited ends.
Meaning?
Nationalist groups become increasingly intolerant of other nations, more aggressive, more willing to go to war. And the major European powers start to exploit these feelings.
How so?
They manipulate the nationalist desires of smaller groups, particularly subject peoples in rival empires, to further their own imperial ambitions. It becomes a tool in the great power game.
And the Balkans emerge as the major danger zone.
The most serious source of tension after 1871. It's a region of incredible ethnic and geographical diversity. Romanians, Bulgarians, Albanians, Greeks, Macedonians, Croats, Bosnians, Slovenes, Serbs, Montenegrins. broadly Slavic peoples in many cases.
And much of it was still under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which was weakening.
Right, so you have Romantic nationalism inspiring these groups to seek independence, just as the Ottoman Empire is decaying. It's an explosive mix.
The Ottoman attempts at reform weren't enough.
They failed to hold the empire together. One by one, subject nationalities fought for and declared independence. And they based their claims on history, arguing they were reclaiming ancient independence lost to foreign rule.
But these new Balkan nations didn't exactly form a happy family.
Far from it. They became intensely jealous of each other, fiercely competing for territory. Each wanted a bigger slice of the shrinking Ottoman pie, often claiming lands inhabited by other Balkan groups.
And the big European powers were fishing in these troubled waters.
Definitely. Russia, Germany, Britain, Austro-Hungary, they all had strategic economic interests in the Balkans. They were rivals, trying to gain influence, expand their trade, secure military advantages, and prevent their rivals from doing the same.
So competing local nationalisms plus competing great power ambitions
led to a series of wars in the Balkans. And this volatile situation, this powder keg, eventually ignites World War I in 1914. Nationalism, combined with imperialism, ultimately led Europe to catastrophe.
A devastating outcome. But the idea of the nation-state itself didn't vanish with World War I, did it?
No. Ironically, it became the dominant model globally. The movements fighting against European colonialism in Asia and Africa were also nationalist movements.
So people fighting for independence from empire were inspired by the very idea of the nation-state that the empires represented.
In many ways, yes. They fought for independent nation-states, forging their own sense of collective unity and the struggle against imperialism. Of course, as sources note, they didn't just copy European nationalism, they developed their own specific forms. But the fundamental idea that society should be organized as nation-states became almost universally accepted.
It's striking to compare that final map, the one celebrating the British Empire, with Britannia on top of the world.
Yeah, figure 20. Colonies symbolized all around, global domination as the source of pride.
Compare that with Sariu's print from 1848 we started with, his vision of diverse nations marching peacefully together towards liberty.
It's a stark contrast. It shows how the potent idea of the nation could be twisted from an ideal of freedom and self-determination into a justification for dominance and conflict.
So quite a journey we've traced. From those initial utopian dreams and the spark of the French Revolution, through the cultural construction of identity, the failures and successes of unification driven by both liberals and conservatives, the unique British path, and finally, that dangerous entanglement with imperialism.
The sources really give us a sense of the complexity, the different paths taken, the sheer effort involved in making nations. It wasn't simple or predetermined at all. It involved struggle, ideas, culture, economics, war, everything.
And it brings us back to Rinan's point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That a nation relies on this shared past, but also this ongoing present-day common will. Given how much conscious effort, how much forging, and sometimes forgetting or inventing went into creating these national identities we explored, it makes you think about national identity today. Is that idea of a daily plebiscite, that constant choice to belong and participate, still the best way to understand what holds a nation together? Definitely something worth pondering.